Hi, everybody. Today I'm in the studio in Paris, and I just wanted to give you a little bit of my perspective on how the culture from Africa, especially in America, because I'm an American, how the culture from Africa has genuinely and impressively influenced all sorts of art, not just music. I'm a musician, but my family, my grandfather was a professional artist. My father is a professional musician. My uncle is a photographer. My aunt is an artist. So, in all walks of art, so to speak, like walks of life, all ways possible, I have really had a lot of great discussions with people, especially colleagues, where we've noticed this huge influence that comes from Africa. And the easiest for me to talk about is music, but I really want to emphasize art in a general way, especially painting, because what I've noticed over the years is when I go to museums, what we usually see is a little bit of a description next to a painting about the artist, his life, and the image. What's in the image, what's the story of the image, etc. Unfortunately, what we don't get is the background of how that person developed his or her style of painting. This goes for sculpture work, this goes for architecture, this goes for dance, uh, performance, theater, all sorts of things. We don't always get the background story. How did how did that particular person study when they were maybe a teenager, when they were even younger? And also influences continue throughout their adulthood. So somebody might be an artist for 15 years and then find an influence that really inspires them to create a new chapter in their work throughout their life. And what I've found, along with other people, we've had these discussions many times, is a lot of those influences, those roads lead back to one place, Africa. Now, as an American, I can tell you that in terms of music in America, in terms of even dress, fashion, ways of speaking, ways of talking, um, it's heavily influenced by the community in America that's of African origin. And that's not just African American, because there's a lot of people that come from other places in North America, such as Canada, the Caribbean. But of course, African American culture is a huge influence on daily life, I would say. I think it would be the most respectful way to put that. Daily life is influenced by African culture. Now, we're talking about music, fashion, way of talking, our movies, everything. And we don't give it enough credit, I think. And that's not my unique perspective. That's from, like I said, we've had a lot of conversations amongst colleagues, musicians, artists about influence. Where does influence come from exactly? And who gets that credit? In fact, the word that's most appropriate is source, like water. Where is the source of this coming from? And along that pathway, as water, you know, not to sound too, I don't know, not to sound too abstract, but as water goes down a river, maybe it goes into a lake, maybe it goes down a cliff, maybe somebody collects it and put it in a bottle for drinking. That's the journey of that water. But where did it come from in the first place? The source of it. And now all along the way, it's going to have an influence. It's going to have an influence on the aquatic life, the fish. It's going to have an influence on the rocks, the sediment. It's going to have an influence in many different ways, including when we drink it, it helps our bodies. Now, all that being said, back to the point, where did it come from in the first place, though? That's the story that we don't really hear about as much. So I wanted to take a moment, along with our team at the Jank Guitar Store, and acknowledge that source. So, for example, I'm going to give you a closing here with one really interesting example. Picasso, the famous artist, Spanish, but spent a huge portion of his life working and living in France. Picasso is a name, he's a top 10 name for artists in the world. You see his name everywhere, you hear about his biography, everything. What we don't really hear is how much African art influenced the thing he's credited for. He's credited for Cubism, which is a particular style of art. You could even say it's a movement of art at a particular time period in history. And Cubism came from this huge influence that African art had on Picasso. And sometimes we think of influence as being many different things combined, and that's true. Sometimes, however, influence comes from one source. And in this case, I mean, that's what happened with Picasso. I remember I was in New York. I mentioned my aunt, she's a professional artist, so being a painter, she's able to describe to me a lot of the technique when we see paintings. We went to an exhibit at the big museum in New York called the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Met. And we were in a collection exhibit where it showed many, many, many different paintings from Picasso chronologically. That means different portions of his life, different periods of his life were on display along his lifespan. And what I noticed was, since he was young, he was incredibly talented. His technique, his painting, just everything was amazing and impressive. He was definitely a prodigy, that's for sure. But the images were rather normal. They were well-known kinds of styles of of art. So they were very well-established styles of painting, is what I'm trying to say. Then there was a moment where it all changed. And Cubism started. It was a completely different style of art. It did not exist in his prior years. So from that moment on, it became the thing we know Picasso for doing. It became his identity as an artist. How many of you knew that came from African art? I would venture to say some. Some of you probably knew that. Most of you probably didn't know that, because I didn't even know that. I researched on that later and found out he had a period where he started very seriously taking a look at African art. The way it's kind of 2D, you can see it too, because most art, especially European art at the time, up until that point, was 3D, like we see in real life. But African art really is 2D in a lot of ways, and you can see it in Cubism because it's really 2D. So anyway, not to be too technical about dimensions, I just wanted to conclude with this example of Picasso and the timeline in his life, and then from a certain point on, he was extremely influenced by African art. But I say influence in the way where it became his style that he's known for. So how come we don't know more about the actual source, which is African art? How come we don't know? When we think of Cubism, when we think of Picasso, how come we don't think of African art? It's just something to think about, to talk about, and I hope the conversation continues. That's the point of discussing it and passing along the information. Thank you for listening. Je vais juste dire un petit mot en français. Je parlais dans cette vidéo de l'influence africaine dans le monde entier pour les arts. Pas juste la musique, je suis musicien, mais dans ma famille, il y a des artistes, des peintres, et au fil des années, j'ai appris beaucoup sur cette influence africaine, surtout sur la musique. Par exemple, dans cette vidéo, je parlais de Picasso. Il y avait un moment dans sa vie où il s'est lancé dans l'art africain, et c'est à partir de ce moment-là qu'il a commencé à créer le cubisme. Et pour Picasso, c'est sa identité. Donc pourquoi est-ce que c'est le cas qu'il y a cette grande influence africaine sur l'art en général, mais c'est pas vraiment une discussion. Ça veut dire que, est-ce que vous saviez que pour Picasso, l'influence de cubisme était vraiment l'art africain? Parce que moi, je ne savais pas du tout. Je crois que c'est important. J'ai beaucoup parlé avec beaucoup de mes collègues au fil des années sur ce sujet-là. Je crois que c'est juste, l'idée ici, c'est de mentionner ça, parce que c'est pas assez mentionné, et c'est tout. Je vous remercie pour votre temps, et à la prochaine fois. Ciao!